library classes. In the earlier section on return function values, the suggestion was made to look at the painter class, the initial example, and split out repeated ideas into functions. Hopefully you did that and noted that prompting the user to return a double value was a similar idea done several times. There's a similar idea in the addition to program that we've talked about. In that case, we were prompting for integers. And while we're thinking of prompting and getting a result, we can also prompt for a string. Of course, we can create functions to do all of these things and embed them into a class for an interactive program. This section is about doing a neater thing, putting them as a class in a separate library that can be used directly for multiple programs. We can create our functions prompt line, prompt int, prompt double, and we're going to put them in their own class, UIF. That's an acronym for user input, and it's our first version. And you can find this in our project UIs uif.cs. Here's the code, and I want to explain the new features. We have a namespace line. We have been using system in all of our programs to get access to the basic C# functions that are provided by the system. We can have other namespaces that allow us to disambiguate different classes that might possibly have the same name in the enormous C# universe. In this book, we're going to use intro CS as a namespace, and particularly where we want to use a class in another project, we're going to include this namespace line. And like other headings, it has a body enclosed in braces. In this case, it encloses the whole guts of the class. And then we have our class. In order to use a separate class in another class, we need to add something to the headings. The class itself must be public. That must be the first word on the heading line. And all the functions that we want to allow to be used elsewhere must also be public. So this is an elaboration of our headings. Here we just copied in the code for the various functions to prompt the user with a prompt string and then produce a value to return in the proper form. Here's the general syntax for defining a part of a namespace. Right after the using statements for what namespace you are using, you want a heading with namespace and the name that you're giving your namespace. And again, we will always use the same one so that we can have our various classes interact. And we have braces enclosing the body, and inside the body is now a class definition or possibly multiple class definitions. Here is another project in our examples that uses the UIF class. Notice that it too has namespace intro CS. All classes that are in the same namespace are automatically easily addressable from other classes in the namespace. If you look here, this is a variation on addition to, and all we did here was, you'll notice the two new lines labeled here, is that where we got data from the user, ints A and B, now we do it all very neatly on a single line. You supply the prompt, you call the UIF.promptInt function, and boom, it returns the int value. very neatly. Notice that because this prompt int function is in the other class UIF, we need the UIF dot here to indicate which class to look at. This is the same use as we have here. Console is a separate class, and we are looking in that class for WriteLine. But this is the first time that we're showing how to do something for a class that you might write. Here is the Addition 3 class in our Addition 3 project in MonoDevelop, and we have not previously had much to do with the references folder underneath here, but we can expand it, and you will notice these are the various things that we are using. One is the system namespace, and then we are using the project UI. The UI project here is where we have our uif.cs file. That is the UIF class. It is important that we have this reference here so that the UIF dot then makes sense. This is a MonoDevelop setup, but we're using MonoDevelop. In the UI project, you'll notice there's another file, ui.cs. This contains a fancier version of user input functions in a class, and we'll be discussing that, and we can use that in place of UIF as we go on. In the previous section on the two roles of functions for the writer and the consumer, we need to think of these library classes, although you may have been the writer or we may have been the writer. In the future, you're going to be a consumer of this library class. You're going to be using it. It's particularly important for a library class that you're going to be using for the interface information for the user to be easily available. Now, we can handle documentation in many different ways. It's been done historically in many different ways. One way is to put it in a separate document that somebody writes, possibly the developer. But much history has shown that if you put it in a separate document, it may either not be written in the first place, or what is really more insidious, not be updated well. And as soon as it's inconsistent with the actual code it's supposedly documenting, it's useless. So in practice, we found that documentation is much more likely to be seen and maintained if it sits right with the code. And of course, we have our comments before class and function headings. Here in UIF, we have comments for documentation before the functions and also the class. There is a variation here from what we've used before. You will notice that there is a third slash starting the comment. That's perfectly legal because everything after the first two slashes is considered part of the comment. That's just a slash that starts it. This is used by separate programs to recognize this triple slash comment that comes directly before a heading. Several lines like we have here with the triple slash before a function. These are documentation comments, and separate programs can extract this information and put it together in a separate document, or as we will see, we can use it directly in MonoDevelop. There are a number of different programs and therefore systems for marking these documentation comments. The official way in C# involves these triple slash comments, but since a separate program is analyzing it, we could have a different system. There's also various ways of distinguishing different parts of the documentation comments. For now, we're just using simple plain text after the triple slashes. Here is an interesting thing if we come in looking at our addition 3 file that's going to be using the UIF. First of all, if I rest my mouse, you see right on top of the UIF here, we have a window that pops up. I can't move the mouse to show it, but notice it's class introcs.uif. It points out the namespace that it's in and the class, and it has the documentation for the whole class that I put, pointing out in this case that it's only the first version. We're going to have a better version later. If I move the mouse over the function name here, notice that also we get a pop-up. Not only does it give the heading public static int prompt int string prompt, it also gives the documentation line with the 3 slashes that came before it in the text. Here it's placed after the heading in this pop-up window. So MonoDevelop is one of those programs that recognizes the documentation comments. And this is handy. Here, these are pretty simple. You just give them a prompt and you get back something. But if you have a function with several parameters and you could forget the order or might confuse several functions, and it could really help to have the explanation, this is a very helpful thing when you're developing and editing your programs. This also works if you're writing functions that are very special to your particular program, but particularly if it's a fairly long program and you might have a number of functions defined, you're somewhere later in your program going to be using these functions, and you too can forget the order of your parameters or something, and these pop-up little windows also work in the same program.